Number 8. Marissa DeVault. In January of 2009, Marissa DeVault took out a $500,000 life insurance policy on her husband, Dale Harrell. She was determined to pay her debt to ex-lover Alan Flores, a man she'd met in 2007 through an online sugar daddy website. DeVault and Flores engaged in an extramarital relationship at first, but by the time their affair ended, she had accumulated a $362,000 debt to him. The man made her sign a promissory note in 2007, saying that she would return the money by December the 31st of 2009. With the due date approaching, DeVault allegedly kept telling Flores a false story about coming into a large inheritance. The man became suspicious and reportedly began documenting her claims, fearing she would harm him to get rid of the debt. He also documented his ex-girlfriend sending him the insurance and telling him she planned to have her husband killed. On January the 14th of 2009, as DeVault's husband was sleeping in the bedroom of their home in Maricopa County, Arizona, she entered the room holding a claw hammer. She walked up to the bed and began striking Harrell in the head with it, causing critical injuries to his skull. He was taken to the hospital, and the woman initially told the police he'd been attacked by an unknown intruder. However, she later changed her story and confessed to beating Harrell, claiming her husband had been abusing her and that she'd acted in self-defense. She was arrested on the same night of the attack on charges of aggravated assault, but was later released on bail. On February the 9th of 2009, Harrell died, and DeVault was charged with first-degree murder. Police then searched Flores' home and found illegal adult films on his computer, along with relevant evidence to prosecute DeVault. The ex-boyfriend was given limited immunity in exchange for his testimony, which would aid in her conviction. On April the 30th of 2014, the woman was found guilty of killing her husband to collect his life insurance policy and sentenced to life in prison. Number 7. Griselle Gonzaga. On December the 7th of 2019, Griselle Gonzaga ordered a rideshare vehicle to get from California to Nevada and visit her ex-girlfriend, Alexa Incandela. Gonzaga had told her a day before that she was planning a surprise, but Incandela told her she wasn't welcome. When the former arrived, she found that the door was locked. Determined to enter, Gonzaga broke into the house through a sliding door in the back and went upstairs to Incandela's bedroom. She and her new love interest, Travis Smith, were lying in bed when Gonzaga entered the room. Enraged at the sight of her ex-girlfriend and her new boyfriend, Gonzaga began attacking her. Smith tried to intervene, but Gonzaga grabbed a pair of tweezers, stabbing him and Incandela with them. The attack continued until Smith was able to drag her outside, but Gonzaga then managed to break into the house a second time and continued her onslaught. She choked Smith unconscious and stomped on his forehead, hard enough to leave a footprint and cause head trauma. The woman eventually left the house after destroying numerous belongings of her ex-girlfriends. Incandela called 911, and responding officers found Smith suffering from head injuries and puncture wounds. Incandela had also suffered lacerations in the attack. Shortly after, Gonzaga was found in close proximity to her ex-girlfriend's house and was arrested. While Incandela was treated at the scene, Smith subsequently died at the hospital. In March of 2021, Griselle Gonzaga was found guilty on charges of voluntary manslaughter and battery, with the use of a deadly weapon leading to substantial bodily hurt, and sentenced to 3 to 10 years in prison. Number 6. Melanie Eam. In the early hours of November the 17th of 2016, James Barry, a man in his early 20s, was found fatally wounded on his bed at his parents' home in Loxahatchee, Florida. His mother's boyfriend, Guy Hand, was awoken to the sound of Barry screaming and rushed in to see what was happening, only to find him lying in a pool of his own blood. He had been stabbed repeatedly, and the attacker had already fled the scene. Hand attempted CPR and called for help, but in spite of his efforts, Barry died before paramedics arrived. Within the course of 3 days, the police arrested the victim's 20-year-old ex-girlfriend, Melanie Eam. Investigators learned that Barry had recently broken up with Eam through a text message, after a relationship that had lasted for roughly 2 years. Shortly after being taken into custody, Eam confessed to a detective she'd stabbed Barry with a butter knife in a fit of rage, angered by his decision to end the relationship via text. When asked how many times she'd struck her ex-boyfriend with the knife, she replied by saying, "I don't know, it's not like I counted." Even though the confession was recorded, Eam pleaded not guilty to second-degree murder during the trial. Moreover, her defense lawyers casted suspicion on Guy Hand, the boyfriend of Barry's mother, because he'd moved the murder weapon. They managed to create reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors, claiming Ian had gotten into an argument with Hand and that Barry stepped in between them, accidentally getting stabbed by Hand in the process. However, Ian was retried in January 2019 and found guilty of her ex-boyfriend's murder. She was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Number 5. Cristina Davila Rodriguez. On March the 5th of 2021, Cristina Davila Rodriguez, aged 24, went to visit her ex-boyfriend, 29-year-old businessman Paulo Roberto Moraes Teixeira Jr. at his home in Manaus, Brazil. Although they were not in a relationship anymore, Rodriguez was still employed at Moraes' internet installation company, where they'd initially met. She'd been asking her former partner to pay for her breast augmentation surgery, but he had told her the company had to cut costs due to economic strife brought about by the pandemic. They were having an argument about the subject at Moraes' house when things became heated and Rodriguez shot her ex-boyfriend in the back of the head with a .380 caliber handgun. She then walked out, called her mother, and confessed the crime. Rodriguez's mother then spoke with Moraes' brother to let him know about the incident, and they left together for his house. They arrived to find Moraes in critical condition in the kitchen. He was rushed to the hospital where he passed away after 2 days. On March the 8th of 2021, a warrant was issued for Rodriguez's arrest, and she surrendered to the authorities. She admitted to shooting her former partner but claimed she had no intention of killing him. She told investigators Moraes had 2 firearms, one in the house and the other in his car. Rodriguez reported she'd taken the one in the house in case she needed to defend herself and shot him by accident. However, the victim's siblings think the woman had planned everything. Her trial is ongoing. Number 4. Alverna Sher Shiu Pin. On May the 16th of 2020, 32-year-old Wee Jun Shang was at a multi-story car park in Bedok, Singapore, where he abruptly suffered a heart attack leading to his death. Later in the day, Singapore police were alerted to a case of unnatural death, and after doing follow-up investigations for over 6 months, they arrested 38-year-old Alverna Sher Shiu Pin, Shang's ex-girlfriend, in relation to the incident. They suspected the woman, who is the director of City Funeral Singapore and a single mother of 2 girls, had committed an unspecified act that resulted in her ex-boyfriend's death. She was arrested and held on remand for further investigations. On December the 3rd of 2020, Shiu Pin was charged with 1 count of culpable homicide, not constituting murder. According to the charge sheet, the woman had caused the death of Xiang, but court documents didn't disclose any further details about how she could have provoked his death. The information was withheld by the authorities so that others wouldn't copy her modus operandi. It became a subject of debate and speculation online, with one theory entertaining the possibility of formaldehyde poisoning, given her access to it as a funeral director. If proven guilty, Alverna Sher Shiu Pin faces either life sentence or a fine and a 20-year-long prison sentence. Number 3. Anaya Thomas and Laniqua Bird. On September the 1st of 2020, Natika Lanier, aged 27, and her girlfriend traveled to Lanier's ex-girlfriend's home in Cocoa, Florida, to confront her about a social media post. As she was exiting her vehicle and entering the apartment complex where 21-year-old Anaya Thomas lived, Lanier went live on social media to stream the ensuing confrontation. She found her ex-girlfriend with her new partner, 19-year-old Laniqua Bird, and the encounter quickly became heated. Thomas told Bird to shoot Lanier, and soon enough gunfire erupted. Natika Lanier was reportedly shot 9 times as she was streaming live on social media. Multiple people in the area who'd heard the gunshots called 911, and police arrived at the scene, where they found Lanier unresponsive. They attempted to render aid until paramedics arrived, and she was later pronounced dead at the hospital. Thomas and Bird were arrested that day after officers held multiple witness interviews and reviewed the video evidence. The 2 are facing charges of second-degree murder. Today's topic was requested by Ale Lagada, Ziz Fuak, Nick TTG, and Kuro Yukihimi. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Shayna Hubers. On October the 12th of 2012 at around 9 p.m., 21-year-old Shayna Hubers called 911 to tell the dispatcher that she'd shot her former boyfriend, Ryan Poston, aged 29, and that he'd stopped breathing. They had dated for about a year and had an on-again, off-again relationship. According to Poston's family, at the time Hubers had shot him, he was trying to break up with her. He'd allegedly scheduled a date with former Miss Ohio, Audrey Bolt, which enraged his ex-girlfriend. Hubers was at Poston's home in Fort Thomas, Kentucky when she made the 911 call. Officers arriving at the scene discovered that he had 6 gunshot wounds in his forehead, back, and torso. Although she was read her rights instead of remaining silent, Hubers immediately told officers she'd acted in self-defense after her boyfriend had allegedly pushed her against furniture in the house. The woman was taken into custody and left alone in the interrogation room, where CCTV recorded her acting bizarre, pacing around, dancing, snapping her fingers, singing Amazing Grace, and chanting, "I killed him, I killed him." A cellmate of Hubers's later revealed that she'd cackled upon commenting on the shooting of her ex-boyfriend, claiming to have given him the nose job he always wanted. In April of 2015, Shayna Hubers was found guilty of first-degree murder, and in August she was sentenced to 40 years in prison. As one of the jurors who'd convicted her was revealed to be a felon, she was granted a new trial. Hubers was also found guilty during her retrial, and she was sentenced to life in prison in October 2018, with prosecutors saying she'd shown no remorse for her crime. Number 1. Rachel Hilliard. Following the breakup with her former partner, 38-year-old Rachel Hilliard insisted that the man's mother, 63-year-old Mickey Davis, come by her house in Wichita, Kansas, to get her son's belongings. On April the 8th of 2017, Davis took her 9-year-old grandson along and headed towards Hilliard's house. When she arrived, Hilliard began assaulting her right in front of the child, who was terrified and immediately fled the scene. However, despite being in shock, the boy managed to grab a phone from his grandmother's car and called 911. Responding police officers found the minor nearly half a mile away from Hilliard's house and asked for his help in leading them back to the scene. After ringing the door and receiving no answer, the authorities checked the garage and discovered Davis's decapitated body. Looking further, they noticed the victim's head abandoned in the kitchen sink. After raiding the premises, officers also found Hilliard hiding inside the house and took her into custody without incident. More evidence emerged in the aftermath, which revealed that the woman had been making bizarre social media posts in the days prior to the attack, writing poems about serial murder and beheadings. During interrogations, Hilliard told investigators that before the brutal attack on Davis, she had called a pastor to perform an exorcism in order to clean her home of evil spirits. A cleric later confirmed the encounter. Hilliard also revealed in an interview that she'd been in a car accident in 2003, which left her with a brain injury, but insisted that it had nothing to do with the killing. Despite her claims of being possessed and not in control of her actions, prosecutors said the woman had premeditated the murder and the subsequent dismemberment. After the minor had left, she grabbed a kitchen knife to behead her ex-boyfriend's mother. At some point, the blade broke, so Hilliard grabbed a second knife to finish what she'd started. In November 2020, she was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Number 7. Joanne Hemingway. In June of 2017, an argument between two neighbors in Hull, England, escalated to physical violence before ending in murder. There had been a history of bad blood between Angela Burkett, a woman in her early 50s, and 39-year-old Joanne Hemingway, both of whom lived on the same road. Burkett, who'd struggled with substance abuse, reportedly regarded herself as the Queen of Beverly Road, and by some reports, resented Hemingway as a potential challenger to her self-given title. Earlier in the day, on June the 29th, the latter had gotten the best of Burkett in a fight witnessed by several other neighbors. Burkett then exacted her revenge, aided by her partner, Glenn Foster. The pair were armed with knives, and Foster also carried a baseball bat as they charged Hemingway. She used a scaffolding pole to try and fend off her attackers, but the skirmish ended with her being stabbed through the chest. She succumbed to the wound, and the authorities initially charged Foster with the murder, a narrative that Burkett was willing to support. When the man wrote to her asking her to reveal the truth of how the altercation had unfolded, she refused to do so. However, in the massive investigation that followed, the authorities concluded that Burkett had dealt the killing blow in what multiple media outlets would describe as a revenge killing. A judge at Hull Crown Court told Burkett it was absurd for her defense to claim that someone else had stabbed Hemingway, while also describing the victim as a much-loved daughter, sister, and mother. Burkett was sentenced to life in prison with parole available after a minimum of 20 years. In April of 2020, while serving her sentence, Burkett passed away after suffering from pneumonia after contracting COVID-19, with reports indicating that she'd refused to take precautionary measures, even though her health was already vulnerable due to hepatitis C. Number 6. Dylan Harrison. In October of 2021, an officer with the Alamo Police Department in Georgia was killed during his first day on the job in a vengeful shooting perpetrated by a man whose friend he'd recently arrested. On the evening of October the 8th, Officer Dylan Harrison stopped an unnamed suspect for a traffic violation in the parking lot of a Circle K across from the police station. The suspect refused to identify himself and a physical struggle ensued in which the officer used his taser on him. The suspect was then arrested and booked into Wheeler County Jail. Upon hearing about the incident, an associate of his, 43-year-old Damian Luke Anthony Ferguson, staked out the police station. At around 1 a.m. on October the 9th, he allegedly ambushed and gunned down Harrison in front of the building. He was survived by a wife and a 6-month-old daughter, and was the first Alamo officer to have been killed in the line of duty. After a brief search, the state of Georgia's SWAT team apprehended Ferguson, and an investigation into the alleged cop killer is ongoing. Number 5. Casey McKinney. On February the 13th of 2018, a woman was gunned down by her ex-boyfriend at an apartment complex on Barton Road in Redlands, California. At the time of the shooting, 31-year-old Casey McKinney was at the residence with her new boyfriend, whose identity wasn't released, and her 4-year-old son. Riverside man Bradley Thomas Wass, aged 33, is believed to have sought revenge on the woman after she'd broken up with him. Wass opened fire on McKinney, inflicting fatal injuries to which she succumbed at the scene, but also took aim at her child and boyfriend. The other man was able to grab the baby and escape the gunfire by jumping from a second-story balcony. Both survived, with the child subsequently placed in protective custody. The authorities launched a search for Wass and a few days later found him dead at the Indian Hills Golf Club in Muraloma. The cause of his demise was reported as a gunshot wound, which appeared to have been self-inflicted. Number 4. David Allen. A man from the Northern Moor area of Manchester was brutally assaulted on June the 4th of 2020 following a series of events that was set in motion after he'd pushed a teenager off his bike. The incident was pieced together by the authorities from surveillance footage and witness testimonies. At some point, 3 teenagers had cycled very close to 23-year-old David Allen. As he was walking on the pavement, Allen reached out and pushed the one nearest to him, causing him to fall off his bike before continuing towards a Tesco Express. The teenager's mother, who'd presumably been informed of the incident in the meantime, then pulled up in front of the Tesco in a Nissan Juke and confronted Allen. He started walking away from her, but she followed him and flagged down a van driven by 30-year-old Aidan Matthews, an acquaintance of hers, telling him that Allen had hit her son. An altercation ensued between the two men in which punches were exchanged that left Matthews with a bloodied face. The latter drove off and picked up his friend, 33-year-old Joseph Stott, from a nearby address. Together they tracked Allen down and proceeded to viciously beat him. Matthews struck him repeatedly with a large metal torch, and Stott forcefully kicked him multiple times as he lay on the ground. The pair then left him in the street and fled the scene, colliding with another car. As they drove away, Allen succumbed to his extensive injuries the following day. One of the strikes had caused his skull to rotate so violently that the right artery inside the lower part of his skull near to the brainstem was torn and caused him to immediately lose consciousness. There were 18 separate areas of bruising to his head, as well as internal bruising within the scalp, forehead, face, chin, and jaw. Matthews and Stott were sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 18 and 16 years served, respectively. Number 3. Roy Jaggers. In August of 2021, a Las Vegas man was viciously tortured for hours before being executed and abandoned in the Nevada desert. 27-year-old Roy Jaggers sometimes babysat for neighbor Heather Pate, also 27. She came to believe that Jaggers had hurt her son, although the claim has been disputed by the man's parents, and he didn't have a criminal history. A former contractor, he'd had to rely on side work as a result of the pandemic. Instead of reporting her suspicions to the authorities, Pate put together a gruesome revenge plot with the help of then-boyfriend Kevin Dent and former boyfriend Brad Menn, both in their late 30s. On August the 1st, she lured Jaggers to her home, where he was confronted, then attacked by her and Dent. According to reports from the sheriff's office, Jaggers was handcuffed and thrown into Pate's car, after which the couple drove to meet up with Menn in the unincorporated town of Pahrump. The trio took Jaggers to a remote desert area where they spent hours, assaulting him with weapons that included an axe, a baton, and knives, as well as a blowtorch. His tormentors then drove Jaggers about 25 miles to Cathedral Canyon, where they stripped him of his clothes and forced him to walk off a cliff. Afterwards, he was shot multiple times. His body was found later in the day, and Pate, as the last person to have been seen with him, became a person of interest. She and Dent were arrested after the police searched their homes. Menn was taken into custody as well, and he ultimately produced the murder weapon. The trio was charged with murder, kidnapping, battery with substantial bodily harm, and conspiracy to commit murder. Their trials are ongoing, but prosecutors stated an intention of seeking the death penalty for men who had acted as the trigger man. Today's topic was requested by Ladiris 007 Love All, SFM Christie, Imran Galfidian, and Carolina Garcia. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Emma Robinson. In October of 2021, two brothers were convicted of attempted murder for firing a shotgun at a woman in Westerhope, Newcastle, England. On October the 3rd of the previous year, at about 10 p.m, Emma Robinson was cooking cottage pie in her kitchen. As she was facing the microwave, the window behind her suddenly shattered, and she felt something strike her in the back, arm, and the side of her face. It would later be determined that what Robinson had experienced was the impact of a shotgun blast. She survived, but her body was peppered with buckshot. Brothers Thomas and James Lee, both in their 20s, would be identified as suspects in the shooting's aftermath. Local authorities investigated the matter and reported that they'd opened fire on the home out of revenge because they'd been involved in an argument with Robinson's son. Roughly 26 hours after shooting her, the Lees fired a shotgun at their cousin, Jordan King, with whom they'd also been embroiled in a dispute. He also survived, and the shooters were found guilty of attempting to wound him with intent. The prosecutor, who'd successfully argued for attempted murder in Robinson's case, pointed out that given the circumstances, the Lee brothers would have undoubtedly noticed that there was someone in the kitchen. Number 1. Denise Nagrodsky. A middle-aged woman was sentenced to 10 years in prison in October of 2015 for attempting to hire a hitman to kill 3 people. 52-year-old Denise Nagrodsky's daughter had been in a relationship with an abusive man who'd reportedly caused her to suffer a miscarriage while she was pregnant with twins. Nagrodsky began searching for someone to make the ex-boyfriend, as well as those close to him, pay for the physical and emotional anguish her daughter had experienced. The vengeance plot involved hiring someone to kill her daughter's ex along with his sister and her boyfriend. An intelligence division of the NYPD discovered that Nagrodsky was looking for a hitman and informed New Jersey law enforcement. An undercover detective for the state police Violent Organized Crime Control South Bureau posed as the prospective assassin and met with Nagrodsky at the Phillipsburg Mall in Lopotcon on November the 21st of 2014. The woman said that she wanted her daughter's ex-boyfriend to be burned alive and told that she was the one responsible for it. The man's sister and her partner were each to be shot twice in the head, with the execution method described by Nagrodsky as once for each twin. Since she couldn't provide the gunman with a firearm, she settled for him bashing their brains in and setting the house where they lived together ablaze. She then gave him $500. On their second meeting, which occurred a few days later, she provided the undercover detective with photos of the victim, a map to their home, and an additional $500. Nagrodsky was arrested shortly after leaving the meeting, but had the authorities not intercepted the murder-for-hire plot, 3 people would have most likely lost their lives. Number 8. Jan Popel. On November the 16th of 2018, police and firefighters in Vancouver responded to an accident on the Barnett Highway where the driver, 31-year-old Jan Popel, had crashed a rented SUV into a streetlight. First responders used specialized power tools to extract the unconscious man from the wreck. In a nearby ditch, the authorities found 34-year-old Nicole Hasselman, also known as Nicole Porciello, who'd been a passenger in the vehicle and had been thrown 30 feet from it. Both were rushed to the hospital, but only Popel survived. While her injuries were consistent with the crash, medics also found 47 stab wounds on Porciello's body. She and Popel had been dating on and off again for roughly 7 years, but weren't together at the time of the accident. Throughout their relationship, Popel had been abusive towards Porciello and jealous of everyone to whom she got close. His possessive hold on her was evident to others, as in spite of how she was treated, Porciello kept giving Popel second chances. However, 9 days before the car accident, the mother of one once again ended their relationship, as she'd begun seeing another man. Chilling evidence emerged in the ensuing investigation, which would reveal Popel as a calculated killer who'd staged the car accident to cover his tracks. On the 16th, while her 10-year-old was at hockey practice, the ex-boyfriend picked Porcello up in the rental. At some point during the ride, Popel pulled out 2 kitchen knives and began stabbing her. Then, as she was gasping for air, he took out his cell phone and recorded a video of them, which was later recovered by the authorities. In a last desperate attempt at saving herself, Porcello could be heard telling Popel that she loved him. The ex-boyfriend showed no mercy or remorse and kept blaming her for the attack. Then, while she was bleeding out in the car, Popel drove back to his home, where for 2 hours he sent various emails and did some online shopping. Afterwards, he intentionally rammed the car into the streetlight, catapulting Porcello, who, unlike him, wasn't wearing a seatbelt, through the windshield. Within a few weeks, Popel was arrested and, after pleading guilty to second-degree murder, was sentenced to life in prison with parole eligibility after 15 years. Number 7. Regan Smith. In the weeks leading up to her death in September of 2018, Queens resident and Air National Guard veteran Regan Smith, aged 31, had filed several complaints with the New York City Police Department against her obsessive ex-boyfriend, 47-year-old Nelson Giron. There had been 2 key incidents involving both her car and that of her new boyfriend, Yonkers police officer Hewitt DePass, as well as a situation in which her apartment door was badly damaged after her ex had forcefully banged on it. The police, however, thought there wasn't enough evidence to go after Giron. Hours before her death, Smith had been called by her ex numerous times before he went to her apartment. It was there that he stabbed DePass, who was off duty at the time, twice, and then shot him in the shoulder. Giron then took his gun and fatally shot Smith in the head before turning the weapon on himself. DePass's injuries were severe, but he ultimately survived. In the aftermath, those close to the victim reported that she was terrified of Giron, and they also expressed frustration at the NYPD's handling of the matter, arguing that they'd been lackadaisical in responding to Smith's complaints. Moreover, Giron was known to the police and he'd been arrested 3 times in New York. In 2014, he'd been taken into custody after being pulled over with more than $100,000 in cash and illegal steroids. More recently, Giron was arrested along with 4 others who'd been moving drugs from Florida at a home in the Bronx where he'd stashed almost 100 pounds of marijuana. Number 6. Jordan Taylor. In early July of 2015, Laura Davis, aged 21, was found barely alive outside the Essex Horse and Pony Protection Society in Pitsey Hall Lane, England. Davis, a valued member of the sanctuary staff, was savagely attacked by her jealous ex-boyfriend Jordan Taylor. They'd been dating for roughly 7 months, a time during which 22-year-old Taylor was possessive and controlling. He would tell Davis what to wear and became enraged when she went out. Davis's sister reported that their conversations, which usually went on for hours, were reduced to minutes as she'd become shut off and subdued. She eventually ended the relationship with Taylor, but he refused to let her go and exacted his revenge in a most violent manner. The man, who reportedly trained in mixed martial arts, went to the horse sanctuary armed with a 6-inch long kitchen knife. He stabbed Davis 87 times with such force that the blade bent at a 45-degree angle. The attack was captured on CCTV, and those who reviewed the footage would describe how Davis had begged her ex to stop as he repeatedly thrust the knife into various parts of her body. Taylor was arrested in the attack's wake and, about a year after the murder, was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 23 years served. Number 5. Arsan Hassan. On September the 18th of 2016, about half an hour before midnight, Polish woman Zofia Sadowska was lured by her ex-boyfriend to a disused kebab shop where he'd once worked in High Wycombe, England. 28-year-old Arsan Hassan had become possessive of Sadowska, aged 20, and he wanted them to be exclusive, but in spite of their sporadic relationship, the young woman was still living with another partner. Hassan was overcome with murderous rage upon learning that she was sleeping with Osmar Asmar, his childhood friend and housemate. Asmar had acted as go-between between Hassan and Sadowska while they were broken up, before eventually engaging in a physical relationship with her. When Sadowska arrived at the rendezvous spot, CCTV footage would show Hassan stalking her from behind some bins. He then used plastic wrap to strangle her to death inside the shop, to which he still had the keys even though it was no longer in use. Hassan then put her limp body in a taxi, telling the driver that she'd passed out from drinking too much, and took her back to his home. The following day at around 5 a.m, emergency services were called to the residence and found Hassan on the floor of his room with slashed wrists, next to Sadowska's body. He would try to dress up the killing through the false claim that he and his ex-girlfriend had made a pact to take their lives together. He thus pleaded guilty to manslaughter but not murder. He was nevertheless found guilty of the latter and sentenced to life with a minimum of 24 years served. Number 4. Isaiah Hagen. In April of 2017, Haley Rathgeber, age 20, was found dead outside a soccer complex in Warwick County, Indiana. She had been shot in the back of the head at close range, and there were no signs that she tried to fight her killer, which led investigators to conclude that they'd known each other. The main suspect in the case was Isaiah Hagen, also in his early 20s, whom some sources refer to as her ex-boyfriend. During interrogations that lasted roughly 7 hours, he changed his story from initially claiming that he'd only met Rathberger briefly to admitting that he'd given her a lift to the soccer complex. Moreover, cell phone data placed him at the time and the scene of the crime. He also said that she'd loaned him $200. A towel with the victim's blood on it would later be recovered from his home. Hagen's mother, Donna, who worked as a corrections officer, would testify at his trial and state that her son had confessed to her that he'd shot Rathberger, claiming it to have been an accident. Donna didn't disclose the supposed confession when first interviewed by detectives. They were suspicious that she'd fabricated a story, knowing that prosecutors would have to prove intent to contradict the accidental shooting version of events. They would ultimately argue that Hagen had shot and robbed Rathberger after money she'd lent him had become an object of contention between them. Hagen, who'd maintained his innocence, faced life in prison but eventually accepted a plea of 60 years, which was upheld on appeal. Number 3. Hugo Castro. In October of 2015, California man Hugo Castro walked into the Santa Clara County main jail trying to turn himself in for killing his ex-girlfriend. He handed a civilian staffer a handwritten note disclosing her body's location. Strangely enough, a deputy turned him away, claiming the case didn't fall under the jail's jurisdiction, and instructed him to take the matter to the San Jose Police Department. The move was later heavily criticized, as it could have potentially resulted in a murderer walking free, and the deputy in question was reassigned. Perhaps stranger still, Castro did exactly as told by the lawman and walked unaccompanied to the police headquarters, where he surrendered once more. He then led officers to a condominium where aspiring nurse Alessandra Barles, aged 27, was found strangled and stabbed to death. Castro would eventually be sentenced to 50 years in prison for the murder. A motive wasn't made public, but in the past, Castro had been imprisoned on charges stemming from domestic violence. In 2009, he was sentenced to 3 years at a work camp in Carson City, Nevada, following a conviction for battery with a deadly weapon against ex-girlfriend Katrina Esparza. She drove from Reno and spoke at his trial, stating that with him behind bars, she no longer lived in fear. Today's topic was requested by Dennis Fate. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Mateo Zavala. Tucson woman Marilyn Pacheco was gunned down in a drive-by shooting on the US's I-29 highway on June the 29th of 2019. The main suspect in the killing of 25-year-old Pacheco was her ex-boyfriend Mateo Zavala, aged 21. According to those familiar with their relationship, Zavala had been stalking Pacheco after they'd broken up. On multiple occasions, he'd threatened to kill her and anyone that she started dating. While worried for her, Pacheco's mother claimed that she never thought Zavala would go through with his menacing claims. On the day of the shooting, Pacheco was in a car with a friend and his young daughter when Zavala pulled up next to them in a second vehicle and unleashed a hail of bullets. Pacheco was fatally struck while the other occupants were injured, but they later recovered. Zavala was taken into custody on charges that included first-degree murder, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and felony endangerment, with bonds set at $1 million. Number 1. David Joshua Reed. In December of 2020, Texas man David Joshua Reed, age 41, killed his ex-girlfriend and her boyfriend by ramming his propane-filled pickup truck into their RV. 23-year-old Shelby Duarte had told Reed that she was pregnant with his child, but that she wasn't going to leave her boyfriend, Timothy Nelson, who, like Reed, was also in his early 40s. Reed was unable to come to grips with her decision and loaded the front seat of his Dodge with propane tanks. He'd hoped that by smashing the pickup into the camper shared by Duarte and Nelson, he'd trigger an explosion and blow himself up in the process as well. Moments before, he sent a chilling message to his ex-girlfriend's phone which read, "You reap what you sow. I will see you in hell," He then smashed his vehicle into the RV, and while it didn't generate the blast he'd expected, the high-speed impact was devastating. Duarte and Nelson were knocked over 65 feet from the camper and struck the front of a house. The latter died at the scene while Duarte was lifted to a local hospital where she too ultimately passed away from her catastrophic injuries. Reed survived the crash, pleaded guilty in court, and in October of 2021 was handed down 2 life sentences.
Number 7. Zach Rodder. In 2019, a woman and her daughter were left homeless after her psycho ex burned down their home in Redruth, Cornwall, England. Charlene Clark and Zach Rodder, both in their early 30s, had a child together during a relationship which had lasted roughly 15 years. In March, Rodder left Clark for another woman. It was an unexpected move which Clark claimed had left her heartbroken. Only a few weeks had passed before Rodder tried getting back together with Clark, but she stood her ground and refused to accept reconciliation. Rodder, however, wouldn't leave the family home, pointing to his name also being on the mortgage. One night, Rodder and Clark attended a family memorial at a friend's house. Rodder got intoxicated and asked that Clark return home with him, which she declined to do. Enraged, he got back to their house and set fire to a mattress. He then sent Clark a series of threatening messages, one of which read, "Look, see the light? I warned you." Rodder went to a pub where he told other patrons that he'd started a fire which grew out of control. Not only had the blaze ravaged Clark's home, but it also expanded to 3 other terraced houses, prompting their occupants to flee for their lives. A disabled woman in one of the burning homes was only rescued because her caregiver was at the address at the time. In the aftermath, the insurance company refused Clark a payout because Rodder was the policyholder. Even though the fire had gutted the homes, no one was seriously hurt, and Rodder was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Number 6. Karina Vanessa Corbalan. In March of 2020, a Florida Instagram model was arrested for fatally shooting her ex-boyfriend outside his Hialeah home. 23-year-old Karina Vanessa Corbalan and Alejandro Sanchez, aged 28, had had a troubled relationship and, according to neighbors, were no longer together at the time of the shooting. Corbalan's popular Instagram page showed the blonde influencer posing in the foreground of several exotic locations, but featured no photos of Sanchez. An argument the nature of which remains uncertain erupted between them and culminated with Corbalan shooting at Sanchez 15 times. 5 of the bullets struck him in the chest. The victim's mother was at the scene and she was heard screaming at Corbalan that she'd killed her son. Corbalan, in turn, presumably not realizing the damage she'd done, was reported to have called out to her ex, wake up, Alex." Officers arrived to the scene and found her kneeling over his body, as well as a black Mercedes, the windshield of which was riddled with bullets. Sanchez was airlifted to Jackson Memorial Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. Corbalan made her first court appearance in a vest designed to deter self-harm and was ordered to be held without bail. Number 5. Stephen Booth. In May of 2021, a builder from Manchester, England, murdered his ex-wife with an axe, then called the police to come and arrest him. Stephen and Susan Booth, both in their 60s, had separated 3 years prior. Up to that point, they'd shared a home in Shaw near Oldham, which Stephen had had a significant role in building. The divorce proceedings were being finalized, and the marital home was proposed for sale at over $620,000. Susan had asked for half of the money, which enraged Stephen, as he felt that she didn't deserve it. Stephen, who hadn't talked directly to his ex for 2 years, was out walking his dog when a solicitor told him that the sale would be completed in 3 days' time. It was at that point that he started plotting Susan's murder. On May the 4th, he lay in wait at the home until she returned from a shift at the Royal Oldham Hospital. He struck her from behind with an axe and then continued his gruesome attack, ultimately inflicting 19 axe strikes, most of them to the head. Susan sustained devastating injuries and was pronounced dead shortly after being rushed to the hospital, where she worked. Stephen called the police and told the operator that he'd just killed his wife and that officers should be sent to his home address to arrest him. He pled guilty to murder and was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 22.5 years served, meaning that he was likely to die behind bars. Number 4. Samantha Mears. In 2019, a woman was sentenced to 20 years in a mental health facility for a 2018 incident in which she'd forced her ex-boyfriend to have intercourse with her while threatening him with a machete. Montana woman Samantha Mears broke into her ex-boyfriend's home, while he was out at a gas station. When the unnamed victim entered the bedroom, she approached him from behind, pressed the blade to his throat, then ordered him to remove his clothes and get on the bed. She then climbed on top of him and they had intercourse, with Mears reportedly biting the victim's arm in the process. The man would later tell the authorities he'd felt forced to comply with his ex's demands for fear of being killed. After the deed was done, Mears reportedly swung the machete around and deliberately urinated on the bed. The victim was able to escape out the back door as his sister arrived home. When interviewed by the police, Mears claimed that their relations hadn't been abusive, but reportedly became incoherent in her answers. She was charged with intercourse without consent, as well as aggravated burglary, assault with a weapon, and unlawful restraint, before eventually being deemed unfit to stand trial. Number 3. Patricia Isidore and Junior Francis. In June of 2018, a woman was seen driving down a Florida highway at around 70 miles per hour, with her ex-boyfriend clinging to the hood of her car. 24-year-old Patricia Isidore and Junior Francis had broken up about 8 months prior, but were still living together. Isidore was getting ready to drive and pick up their daughter. Francis, who didn't want her to go because he also needed the car, launched his body onto the vehicle's hood. As Isidore would later tell officers, she didn't want to deal with any foolishness, so she just kept driving. The video of him holding on for his life on the highway, initially shared on Twitter, subsequently became viral. While clinging to the hood with one hand, Francis used the other to call the authorities, convinced he was going to die. He survived the hellish ride, largely unharmed, while Isidore was charged with culpable negligence, a misdemeanor, and was bonded out. Today's topic was requested by Andrei Korbachenko, Ale Lagarda, and King Eric. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Bonita Vivian Coué. In June of 2021, Bonita Vivian Coué was arrested for the premeditated and brutal killing of her ex-husband, Kerry Michael Rooney, at his Newmarket home in Brisbane, Australia. A witness had filmed the moment that neighbors rushed to help 51-year-old Rooney as he was lying in a pool of his own blood in the middle of the street. Coué, aged 53, had been monitoring Rooney's habits in the weeks leading up to the horrific attack. She went to his apartment armed with 2 knives, a bottle of bleach, and the toy replica of a gun. She waited in the staircase of his building and ambushed the father of one. When he returned home, Coué sprayed him in the face with the bleach and, as he turned around, stabbed him in the back and slit his throat. She continued to slash and stab Rooney as he ran down the street, screaming for help. One of the knives was reportedly still lodged in his body when the police arrived at the scene. Coué used the toy gun to deter bystanders from intervening, including a neighbor who'd sought to confront her with a baseball bat. Following her arrest, she'd allegedly told officers that she didn't want to pay child support anymore. Her trial is ongoing, but Coué refused legal representation, claiming she couldn't afford it, even after being told that it could be provided at no charge. She tried to claim self-defense, but detectives assigned to her case reported that there was no evidence of it. Number 1. Joseph Oberhansley. In December of 1998, in a meth-fueled jealous rage, Utah man Joseph Oberhansley gunned down his teenage girlfriend. He proceeded to shoot his mother, who survived, and then fired at his sister, but missed. In a bid to end his life, Oberhansley tucked the gun under his chin and pulled the trigger. He didn't die with the bullet instead becoming lodged in his head, effectively giving him a partial lobotomy, the part of his brain that was affected by the gunshot controls emotions, personality, decision-making, and self-control. He ultimately pled guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Oberhansley would later tell a parole board that he regretted killing his girlfriend and that having a bullet in his frontal lobe had made him calmer. However, according to his family members, it turned him into a monster, and they noted increasingly obsessive behavior. Even though some of his relatives insisted that Oberhansley remain locked up, he was paroled in 2012 and transferred to Indiana. In 2015, he started dating 46-year-old Tammy Jo Blanton, who was 13 years his senior. Oberhansley was vague about his past, but Blanton eventually learned the truth, which, in the context of his controlling behavior, caused her to fear him. She ended their relationship and asked her father to change the locks of her home. In the early hours of September the 11th of 2014, Blanton called the police claiming that her ex-boyfriend was trying to break into her house. Officers arrived at the address and confronted Oberhansley, who agreed to leave. Later in the day, the police went to check on Blanton again after she hadn't shown up for work. There were signs of forced entry at her home, and Oberhansley answered the door, claiming she wasn't home. Officers searched him and found a knife in his pocket, covered in blood and hair. In the bathtub, they discovered Blanton's mutilated body under a camping tent. She'd been beaten, stabbed, and cut open with an electric saw. Parts of her lungs, heart, and brain had been extracted and cooked in a skillet. Oberhansley admitted to officers at the scene that he'd killed and eaten part of his ex, but subsequently changed his story, claiming he was being framed by two intruders. He made a series of bizarre statements, which included him being able to hear Blanton's thoughts, and complained of a tingling in his head, telling interviewing officers, "I'm like electrifying right now." Oberhansley was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Number 9. Frances Hall. 53-year-old Texas woman Frances Hall was sentenced to 2 years in jail for killing her husband Bill after discovering his years-long affair with a woman by the name of Bonnie Contreras. Bill, aged 50, had a history of cheating on Frances throughout their entire marriage, yet she'd reportedly always forgiven him. In 2010, Bill began yet another affair with 34-year-old Contreras and hid it from his wife for 3 years. When Bill allegedly began to lose interest in Contreras in October of 2013, she threatened to tell Frances about their relationship. She started harassing the woman with text messages and even sent explicit photos and videos of her having intimate relations with her husband. A few weeks after Frances had found out about the affair, she kicked Bill out of their home. However, the very next day she saw the man riding his motorcycle down the road, while Contreras followed behind in her car. Frances was angry and later maintained that she wanted to confront Contreras to tell her that she could have her husband, but to leave her and her children out of it. She followed them down the road, but the resulting chain of events ended with Bill fatally crashing his motorcycle. Contreras and Frances had different accounts of what happened in the incident. The former alleged that Frances intentionally sideswiped her husband, causing him to crash, while the latter claimed that it was an accident. She stated that at some point Bill had gotten behind both their cars and that Contreras intentionally braked hard, causing her to do the same, which didn't give Bill enough time to slow down. He wasn't wearing a helmet and suffered massive blunt force trauma to the head. Bill was rushed to the hospital but was unable to recover from his injuries. In September of 2016, Frances was found guilty of murder and aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and was released in September of 2018. Number 8. Monica Forey. In October of 2015, Monica Forey poured boiling water on her husband's 24-year-old lover, Hannah Stokes, burning her head, neck and chest. The affair between Stokes and Wouter Forey had started in the summer of 2015 in Plymouth, England. 34-year-old Monica had begun suspecting her husband was being unfaithful and questioned him about it. He eventually came clean about the affair, which prompted her to leave their home and stay at a friend's house. However, she unexpectedly returned on October the 24th of 2015 to find Wouter sitting on the sofa with Stokes and watching rugby together. Eerily calm, Monica claimed she'd go into the kitchen to make a cup of tea. Moments later, she came back into the living room with a cup of boiling water that she poured on Stokes. Monica then got the entire kettle from the kitchen and emptied it on Stokes after grabbing her by the hair. The former was convicted of causing grievous bodily harm with intent and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Stokes was treated for second-degree burns and had surgery for a punctured eardrum in her right ear, but ultimately lost 25% of her hearing. Number 7. Jiang Jun. In June of 2018, Jiang Jun was attacked by a furious, unnamed woman with fish sauce and chili after allegedly having an affair with her husband. The scorned spouse showed up to 30-year-old Jun's beauty shop with a group of women and dragged her by her hair into the street. With the help of her companions, the angry woman stripped June of her clothes and poured fish sauce all over her body, followed by extra hot chili powder. A witness told the police that the women were screaming curse words at June during the assault that left her with serious cuts on her face and neck, as well as burns from the chili powder. By the time law enforcement had arrived, the group of women had already fled the scene, leaving June in the middle of the street. She was rushed to the hospital where she was treated for her injuries. For the attack, the scorned woman would have faced charges of humiliating another person, intentionally inflicting injury and causing public disorder. Police encouraged June to make an official complaint, but she refused to identify her aggressor because she feared the consequences of doing so.
Number 6. Kashina Mordika. On Valentine's Day 2017 in Miami, Florida, Kashina Mordika ran over her husband's mistress, Ashley Weatherspoon, after catching them together. Mordika's 32-year-old husband, Marco Mack, was in a long-time love triangle with both women. When she saw the pair together on the night, she confronted them and a fight broke out between her and Weatherspoon. It culminated with Mordika getting back in her car and plowing into the mistress. Weatherspoon's leg was severed in an instant, but Mordika kept driving and left the scene. Weatherspoon was rushed to the hospital where she ultimately had her leg amputated. Mordika was later arrested and charged with attempted second-degree murder and leaving the scene of an accident. Although he hadn't been involved in the attack, Mack was also arrested on outstanding warrants for grand theft and burglary. Number 5. Natalia Krasko. A 28-year-old Russian woman was accused of assaulting her husband's mistress when she showed up to their marital apartment, demanding she leave. Natalia Krasko married 88-year-old Ivan Krasko, a well-known actor, in September of 2015. However, shortly after they tied the knot, Natalia refused to be intimate with Ivan because she was reportedly worried about getting pregnant. Reacting to her decision, the man told Natalia that he wanted a divorce and started seeking out other women. He met 27-year-old Yulia Kichimasova and began having an affair with her behind his spouse's back. Then in September of 2018, Yulia showed up with bags and ready to move into the apartment that Natalia and Ivan shared in Moscow. Ivan wasn't at home when she arrived, but Natalia was, and became enraged when Yulia demanded that she pack her things and leave. As Yulia tried pushing past Natalia to unpack her belongings, the latter allegedly grabbed her by the hair and smashed her head into a table multiple times before punching her. Yulia stated that she would report the incident to the authorities, but no updates were given as to whether or not she followed through on her intention. Yulia was left with a black eye, bleeding lips, and a bleeding nose from the incident. Natalia completely denied the attack, only stating that she'd thrown the mistress and her belongings out of her home, but never assaulted her. Shortly after the scandal, the divorce between Ivan and Natalia was finalized. Just 2 years later, on December the 4th, 90-year-old Ivan had a child with Yulia. Number 4. Anne Anastasi. 44-year-old Anne Anastasi and her husband Anthony had a three-way relationship with a young woman named Jacqueline Riggs. Their arrangement became troublesome after Anthony moved 25-year-old Riggs into the home he shared with Anne in Maryland. Tension began to brew among them within close quarters, causing the married couple to break up. In spite of the separation, Anthony and Riggs continued their relationship and moved into the basement of the house. The decision angered Anne, so she began plotting to kill the couple with the help of her teenage daughter and her daughter's 18-year-old boyfriend, Gabriel Struss. Anne was the alleged mastermind behind the plot, manipulating her daughter into planning the killings with her and using Struss as the hitman. Anne ordered the latter to shoot 40-year-old Anthony and then stab Riggs to death. The teenager did as instructed, and several hours after the murders, Anne called the police. She claimed to have found her husband and Riggs dead, trying to suggest that it had been a murder-suicide. However, the police soon discovered that the gun that had killed Anthony didn't match the one that was found next to him. During their investigation, the authorities retrieved text exchanges between Anne and Struss that discussed the killings. The gunman later pleaded guilty to the first-degree murder of both victims and was sentenced to 60 years in prison. Anne was also sentenced to 60 years in prison, while her daughter was charged as a juvenile. Number 3. Jennaire Girardeau. 49-year-old Jennaire Girardeau lost her job in 2017 and had trouble finding a new one. As a result, she and her husband Mark decided that they needed a fresh start, and the latter started looking for job openings. He found a position at the University of Delaware and reached out to his soon-to-be supervisor, 33-year-old Meredith Chapman. He landed an interview, got the job, and moved from South Carolina to Delaware a month and a half before Jennaire was able to join him. Working closely together, Mark and Meredith soon fell for each other and had already begun having an affair by the time Jennaire arrived in Delaware. The woman realized something was off with her husband and asked him if it had anything to do with Meredith, whom he'd mentioned to her a few times regarding work. After Mark's persistent denial, Jennaire finally revealed that she knew about the affair because she'd hired a company that allowed her to gain access
to all of the man's phone records, messages, and photos. She'd even sewn a recording device into the lining of his coat so that she could listen to the conversations he had with Meredith in person. The woman had also placed trackers on both his and Meredith's cars to monitor their whereabouts at all times. From that point on, their marriage rapidly deteriorated, and Mark eventually told Janair that he wanted a divorce. Realizing that she'd lost her husband, Janair decided to take revenge on the mistress. On April the 23rd of 2018, she broke into Meredith's house when she wasn't home and waited for her to return. The moment she walked in, Janair shot her dead, then turned the gun on herself and took her own life. Number 2. Lauren Gray. 38-year-old Lauren Gray confronted her husband's mistress, Amanda Boylan, in front of a school in Paisley, Scotland, on January the 30th of 2018. It was the first time that Gray and Boylan had seen each other since the former had found out about the affair. Upon seeing the other woman, Gray grabbed her by the hair and punched her in the face, leaving Boylan with a bloody nose. She then got in her car and drove home, where police arrested her later that day. Gray pleaded guilty to the assault and was fined nearly $490. Number 1. Tammy Mora. In 2014, Tammy Mora was accused of kidnapping her husband's mistress, 20-year-old Heather Elvis, who had been missing since December of 2013 in South Carolina. Elvis and Sydney Mora, aged 42, had begun an affair after meeting at a restaurant where the former worked. 46-year-old Tammy had allegedly become jealous of the relationship Sydney had with Elvis. In October of 2013, she started harassing the young woman by calling her incessantly and sending her pictures of her and Sydney being intimate. Elvis was reportedly ready to move on from the relationship. Then on December the 19th of 2013, local police received a call about a suspicious car parked at a secluded boat landing. The vehicle belonged to Elvis. All of her belongings were inside, but the young woman was nowhere to be found. Police investigated Elvis's phone records and found that Sydney had called her from a payphone the night before, saying that he'd left his wife and wanted to see her. Investigators would later determine that it was a trap set by the married couple to lure her to them. Grainy surveillance footage had shown Sydney's black truck driving to and from the same boat landing on the night that Elvis was there, around the same time of her disappearance. In 2014, the couple were charged with murder and kidnapping, but the murder charges were later dropped due to a lack of evidence. In 2017, Sydney's trial for kidnapping resulted in a mistrial because the jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict. Sydney went on to serve a 10-year sentence for obstruction of justice in connection to the case, while Tammy was sentenced to 30 years for kidnapping. Number 7. Fabio Di Lello. Italian woman Roberta Smagiassi, aged 33, was killed in a traffic accident in the summer of 2016, in which an oblivious motorist ran a red light and consequently plowed into her while she was riding a moped. In the tragic incident's aftermath, the victim's husband, 34-year-old banker and semi-professional footballer Fabio Di Lello, waged a vendetta against the individual responsible for his wife's premature demise. The embittered widower tracked down the driver, named as Italo De Lisa, to a cafe in the Abruzzo commune of Vasto in early 2017. Then Di Lello, armed with a handgun, walked right up to 22-year-old De Lisa and gunned him down while he sat outside the restaurant. Shortly thereafter, the man walked to the cemetery where his wife had been buried and placed the gun on her gravestone. He then went to the police station to turn himself in. Prior to carrying out the vengeful shooting, Di Lello had reportedly changed his Facebook profile picture to a screenshot from the 2000 film Gladiator. The specific photograph Di Lello chose came from the scene in which Russell Crowe, portraying the character Maximus, delivered the famous line, "Father to a murdered son, husband to a murdered wife, and I will have my vengeance in this life or the next." During the case's court proceedings, the defense team argued that although Di Lello had been charged with manslaughter in connection to the fatal vehicle crash, Di Lello feared that he wouldn't be properly brought to justice and thus took the law into his own hands. Prosecutors labeled the shooting a tragedy within a tragedy and called for Di Lello to be sent to prison for the rest of his life. In March of 2017, however, the man was ultimately sentenced to 30 years in prison. Number 6. Obinna Ezioke.
In the early morning hours of September the 15th of 2016, confessed drug dealer Obinna Ezeoke snuck into a North London residence belonging to 53-year-old Annie Ikofo. It was subsequently reported that Ezeoke had been involved in a long-running feud with another member of Ikofo's family. However, in a tragic instance of mistaken identity, the mother of 9 and her nephew, Berville Kalikaka Ikofo, were fatally shot by Ezeoke, who then fled the scene in a black Vauxhall Mariva. The career criminal ultimately faced criminal charges in connection to the double murder, and after standing trial 5 separate times, was finally convicted in October of 2020. Although Ezeoke outright denied having any involvement in the Ikofo's killings, the police reportedly reviewed CCTV footage in which he was shown fleeing the scene of the crime in the vehicle registered to him. Following his conviction, Ezeoke was sentenced to a minimum of 40 years in prison. Number 5. El Tacamor and Telebra Cherry. At about 11:45 a.m. on Easter Sunday 2017, 46-year-old El Tacamor and her daughter, Telebra Cherry, went to the Parkway Place apartments in Louisville, Kentucky, to confront 2 women with whom they were involved in an unspecified feud. In the resulting arrest report, it was detailed how Moore and Cherry became engaged in a physical altercation with their 2 rivals. 29-year-old Cherry allegedly used a baseball bat to damage one of the women's vehicles before turning the weapon on the woman herself. During the course of the incident, the other woman, later identified as Tania Woods, was fatally shot by Moore, according to police records. After being beaten with Cherry's bat, Tayela Love also sustained a non-fatal gunshot wound to the stomach, for which she was later treated at University of Louisville Hospital. Although initial reports on the matter suggested that Moore and Cherry had been the instigators of the cold-blooded attack, and they were charged with murder and assault accordingly. However, when the case eventually went to trial, it was concluded that the mother and daughter had actually been acting in self-defense during the double shooting, and they were therefore acquitted of the criminal charges in February of 2019. Number 4. Anthony Lorenzi. A young couple was dragged from their car and gunned down following a traffic dispute during the Puerto Rican Day Parade in Chicago, Illinois on June the 19th of 2021. According to local authorities, Giovanni Azuega, aged 24, and his girlfriend of many years, 25-year-old Yasmin Perez, had been driving through the city's Humboldt Park neighborhood when they were involved in what was described as a minor traffic accident. Immediately following the seemingly inconsequential fender bender, a group of men encircled the couple's vehicle and began to unleash a barrage of punches and kicks. Shortly thereafter, as was captured on video by a nearby witness, the assailants opened the car doors and forcibly removed Azuega from inside before unleashing a brutal attack on him in the middle of the street. The group assault, which was allegedly meant as a form of retaliation against the couple for the accident, was eventually interrupted by convicted felon and Latin king Anthony Lorenzi. Although he hadn't been involved in the initial conflict, Lorenzi reportedly inserted himself into the altercation at some point. During the ensuing physical struggle, Perez rushed to defend her boyfriend and was consequently shot in the neck. It was later detailed how it had been deemed more than likely that the woman had accidentally been shot by Azuega, who'd brandished a firearm in an attempt to ward off his attackers. The incident culminated with Lorenzi fatally shooting Azuega in the head. Perez ultimately passed away at the hospital a couple of days later. In the wake of the shooting, Lorenzi fled the state, but was eventually located in California and arrested by U.S. Marshals, who then relinquished him to Cook County law enforcement. Lorenzi, whose criminal track record includes 26 past arrests, was held in custody without bond while awaiting his case's court proceedings. Number 3. Stephen Ruth. Long Island resident Stephen Ruth was taken into police custody after he was accused of intentionally damaging 19 traffic light cameras in Brookhaven in April of 2016. In subsequent reports, it was described how the 42-year-old had developed a vendetta against red light cameras and had thus made it his personal mission to tamper with as many of them as he could. Ruth allegedly snipped the wires to the cameras and knocked some of them off kilter so All they would record was the sky. New York officials also accused him of cutting down a red light camera pole on Old Town Road in Coram on January the 18th. The total cost of the damage Ruth caused was estimated to be roughly $25,000. On the night of April the 12th, NYPD officers tailed the man to his Center Reach residence and arrested him on felony criminal mischief charges. Although Ruth faced the potential of spending up to 7 years behind bars for the offense, he ultimately reached a plea deal with prosecutors which sentenced him to 1 year of probation in lieu of jail time. Ruth initially rose to national prominence in 2015 when he publicly announced his crusade against Long Island's red light camera system, which automatically sends traffic tickets to anyone who runs a red light. He claimed that the city had shortened the duration of yellow lights to force more motorists to run through red lights, resulting in increased traffic tickets. Ruth further argued that the traffic light cameras set up throughout Long Island were illegal because they'd never been approved by licensed engineers.
See what I just did? All it took was a pair of balls and a painter's extension rod. I just saved people about $10,000 today with this camera.
Today's topic was requested by Old Man Kizuki. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Teo Wesley. West London man Teo Wesley was embroiled in an intense personal feud with Tony Charlery for the better part of 15 years, as was detailed in subsequent reports on the matter. Wesley had believed Charlery to have been responsible for the 1999 death of his sister, Bolaji, and had thus held an intractable grudge against him. Bolaji, who'd been living with Charlery in Earl's Court at the time, had plummeted to her death after falling out of a third-story window. In 2002, Charlery was brought to trial in connection to the deadly incident, but was ultimately acquitted of any criminal wrongdoing by a jury at the Old Bailey, a decision which infuriated Wesley. 2 years later, the latter reportedly attacked Charlery with an iron bar outside his home, for which he was charged with causing grievous bodily harm with intent. Although Wesley was later cleared of the charges, investigators indicated that he'd openly admitted to carrying out the attack against his rival. Wesley's personal vendetta came to a violent culmination in August of 2014 when he reportedly encountered 59-year-old Charlery in Notting Hill and proceeded to fatally stab him in the neck. The man was subsequently taken into police custody in connection to the revenge killing. During the case's eventual trial, Wesley contended that he hadn't originally intended to kill Charlery, but that upon seeing him on the day of the deadly altercation, he'd been overcome with rage and consequently lost control of his actions. He ultimately pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 21 years behind bars. Number 1. Travis Satterwhite. A gang leader from Bridgeport, Connecticut, pursued a personal vendetta against the man whom he believed to have targeted him during a shootout in the summer of 1998. The feud reportedly originated on August the 10th of that year when Travis Satterwhite exited the Golden Hill Street courthouse after attending a hearing. The man was met with a barrage of gunfire but was able to duck back inside the building before sustaining any injuries. It subsequently emerged that 21-year-old Dante Jones, a UPS worker from Stratford, had been gunned down during the incident in which he had no personal involvement. Satterwhite blamed the shooting on a member of the city's foundation gang named Jermaine Baby Boy Reese. The latter stood trial for Jones's murder in 1999, but the jury assigned to his case found him not guilty, indicating that he hadn't been the one to launch the attack on Satterwhite either. Despite the verdict handed down in Connecticut Superior Court, Satterwhite refused to give up his fixation on Reese, whom he still blamed for his attempted murder. The gangster held on to his grudge for 7 years, before finally taking retaliatory action in December of 2006. On the 27th of that month, Satterwhite tracked his rival down to an East End street corner and fired upwards of 40 fatal rounds into his head, torso, and extremities. During the case's eventual court proceedings, Satterwhite pleaded guilty to reduced charges of conspiracy to commit murder and was sentenced to 7 years in prison, followed by 10 years of special parole. Reese's family publicly decried the man's sentencing, which they considered astonishingly lenient, given the extremely violent and purposeful nature of the shooting.
Number 8. David Bonola. On April the 16th of 2022, human remains were found stuffed in a hockey bag on the side of the road in the Forest Hills neighborhood of Queens, New York City. Investigators followed up on a blood trail, and the victim was identified as Hungarian national Orsolya Gal, a 51-year-old mother of two. The lack of forced entry into her home led law enforcement to believe that Gal knew her killer. A note on her refrigerator read, "Get a new handyman," and it proved vital in the police eventually identifying the suspect as 44-year-old David Bonola. He and the married woman had had an on-again, off-again affair, lasting for about 2 years. During that time, Bonola, a Mexican immigrant living in the U.S. illegally, had done handiwork around Gal's home. 4 days after the woman's brutal murder, the police stopped Bonola near the crime scene and took him into custody. Upon speaking to detectives, he reportedly made several incriminating statements before eventually giving a confession. Bonola told law enforcement that Gal had been seeing other men and that he felt she'd used him. He also reported that he wanted payback as he thought she'd given him HIV. As an argument about the end of their relationship escalated, Gal asked him to leave, but he refused, at which point she allegedly threatened him with a knife. Bonola took the knife from her, slashed her throat, and inflicted close to 60 other wounds. He then placed her lifeless body in her son's duffel bag and abandoned it in the neighborhood. Less than a mile from her home, he was charged with second-degree murder, burglary, concealment of a human corpse, and tampering with physical evidence. Number 7. Elizabeth Lena James. On August the 15th of 2018, law enforcement in Lawrence, South Carolina, responded to reports of animal cruelty at a property on Lisbon Road. They arrived to find a mastiff mix named Champ, who was severely emaciated and covered in maggots, at the home of 30-year-old Elizabeth Lena James. The dog was roughly 60 pounds underweight and too weak to stand on his own. He'd belonged to James's ex-boyfriend, following the breakup in a twisted act of revenge. James kept Champ chained up and for months refused to feed him, even though she kept giving food to her own dogs. The woman was arrested for animal cruelty and booked at the Lawrence County Detention Center on a $15,000 bond. Champ was placed with Rescue Dogs Rock NYC and began recovering, with his progress updated through a Facebook page called Justice for Champ. For her horrific treatment of the dog, James was sentenced to 90 days in jail. Number 6. Candice Nicole Jones and Edward Brannon Barry, both aged 32, pleaded guilty in a Texas court to a revenge killing in April of 2019. The victim, Texas woman Emily Hacker, had been found buried in a burned-out shallow grave about 10 days since her disappearance in January of 2017. Prior to her murder, she'd been stopped by the police on a traffic violation, and a search of her truck produced a loaded handgun. According to an affidavit, 34-year-old Hacker told the police that the weapon belonged to Jones, and the latter subsequently planned to murder her in revenge. She elicited Barry's help, as well as that of 3 other people who'd subsequently be indicted. Hacker's cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma. The suspects put her body in a zippered bag and moved it to Lyons, about 40 miles from her home in Rockdale, where they buried it and then burned the shallow grave's contents in an effort to destroy the evidence. As of subsequent information pertaining to the case, Jones and Barry were each sentenced to 50 years in prison, following a plea deal in which they waived their right to appeal. Their accomplices, Ashley Yvonne Wesson Zawadsky, John Wayne Stewart, and Kevin Cormier, pleaded guilty to lesser charges. The latter was given the most lenient sentence of probation for 10 years after admitting that he'd helped move Hacker's body. Number 5. Hannah Starr Issa. In late September of 2022, law enforcement in Cypress, California, received reports that a pedestrian had been struck by a vehicle near a local park. They arrived to find the body of 43-year-old Luis Anthony, a father of 5. Earlier that evening, a confrontation had occurred between him and 20-year-old Hannah Starr Issa, which the young woman had recorded on her cell phone. She accused him of trying to run over a cat in the street. They argued for some time before Issa got back inside her vehicle. She then made a 3-point turn and barreled towards Anthony, filming the entire incident in what the authorities would describe as her exhibiting a complete disregard for human life
The young woman hit Anthony with her car. He was thrown onto her windshield and flipped over her vehicle several times before landing on the street and dying on impact. Issa was taken into custody on murder charges, with her bond set at $1 million and her arraignment scheduled for October the 13th. Number 4. Abdul Abu Mahmoud. In the early hours of Good Friday 2017, a hitman kicked open the front door of a home in Glenfield in Sydney's southwest. He shot teenager Braden Dillon in the head as he was sleeping in his bed, and he later passed away. 3 months later, local authorities arrested Conrad Craig, a member of the Brothers for Life street gang, and charged him with murder, but he refused to reveal his motive. In January of 2019, while in detention at Lithgow Jail, 29-year-old Craig started cutting his face and arms with a pair of scissors in a bid to get the attention of a detective working on Dillon's case. He asked to be moved from his current prison and revealed not only that he'd been responsible for the killing, but also that it had been a form of gangland retribution. Craig told investigators that he'd been hired and paid $20,000 for the hit on Dillon by a man named Abdul Abu Mahmoud. The latter had picked him up from Cessnock prison when he was released on an unrelated charge and provided him with a weapon and ammunition. Dillon's older brother, Joshua, had been charged with fatally stabbing Abu Mahmoud's nephew, Adam, in a Panania street fight in 2016. He was eventually found not guilty on grounds of self-defense, but while he was in custody, Abu Mahmoud contracted Craig to attack his innocent younger brother as retribution. Craig described the fatal outcome of the revenge plot as a kneecapping gone wrong and was sentenced to at least 40 years in prison in the aftermath. Abu Mahmoud, who sported tattoos that read "Revenge is a dish best served cold" and "Eye for an eye" on his legs, was found guilty of murder in September of 2020 and faced a sentence of life in prison. Number 3. Andrew Hall and Cheyenne Blaylock. Oklahoma man Andrew Hall and his teenage girlfriend, Cheyenne Blaylock, were charged with murder in January of 2020 in an incident allegedly sparked by the former's desire for payback. On New Year's Day, the body of Kirsten Patterson was found just south of Locust Grove at the Spring Creek boat ramp on the Neosho River. She'd been reported missing and was a suspected runaway before law enforcement discovered that she'd been fatally shot in the head. Patterson was a schoolmate of Blaylock's at Shoto High School, at whom Hall was angry for allegedly giving him an STD. As per Blaylock's subsequent testimony, he'd instructed her to text the victim, inviting her to take a ride with him. Patterson met the couple, at which point either Blaylock or Hall ambushed and shot her in the head with a hunting rifle. It wasn't clear who'd pulled the trigger, as following their arrest on the same day as the body's discovery, the teen and her 30-year-old boyfriend pointed the finger at each other. They were both eventually found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. Today's topic was requested by Look Who's Watching. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Fabio De Lello. 33-year-old Italian woman Roberta Smargiassi was killed in a car crash in 2016 after a man had run a red light and crashed into her scooter with his Fiat. 22-year-old Italo De Lisa faced manslaughter charges in connection to the incident. In the aftermath, Smargiassi's husband, Fabio De Lello, fell into a deep depression and reportedly felt like he couldn't trust Italy's dysfunctional courts to prosecute De Lisa. He left a clue of what was to come on Facebook when he changed his cover photo to one showing Maximus Decimus Meridius, Russell Crowe's character in the Gladiator film. A former general in command of Roman legions, the character fell into slavery and became a gladiator while seeking vengeance for the killing of his wife and daughter. 34-year-old De Lello, a baker and semi-professional soccer player, tracked De Lisa down outside a cafe in Vasto on January the 1st of 2017. He brandished a 9mm handgun and fatally shot him 3 times as payback for running over his wife. De Lello then went to Smargiassi's grave and placed the weapon on it. As the police were called to the cemetery, they took the man into custody and charged him with murder. Prosecutors described the incident as a tragedy within a tragedy, while DeLalo's lawyer told a media outlet he never imagined he was planning a vendetta. He stated that his client had no experience in handling firearms, but did note that he was in a very fragile psychological state. For the brazen revenge killing, DeLalo was eventually sentenced to 30 years in prison. Number 1. Emma Pressler. On August the 6th of 2021, residents in the Houston suburb of Kingwood were alerted by the sound of an explosion. In the moments that followed, couple Carissa Lindros and Devin Graham ran out of their home, both engulfed in flames. A neighbor would later tell the police that 33-year-old Graham no longer had any clothes and his skin was peeling off. As he was screaming his lungs out, he suffered burns to 90% of his body and passed away a few days later. His girlfriend, 26-year-old Lindros, was left in critical condition with burns covering 70% of her body, but she ultimately survived. A white female was seen leaving the scene of the fire in a 4-door sedan, and she'd later be identified as 19-year-old Emma Pressler. Before dying, Graham revealed that she'd broken into their home and set both him and Lindros ablaze using gasoline. Lindros couldn't speak on account of her severe injuries, but when the police talked to her on August the 16th, she confirmed that Pressler had been the culprit. She motioned a lighter when asked how she'd set them on fire. There was evidence that the two women knew each other, and gang-related payback was suspected as the root cause of Pressler's actions, although the details weren't disclosed. The teenager had made headlines the year prior when she was linked to the murder of 20-year-old Sierra Rod, a cerebral palsy sufferer from Harris County. She was killed inside her home, which was struck by a flurry of bullets in a drive-by shooting. The target had actually been Rod's teenage brother, who'd reportedly been feuding with a Houston area gang known as 10K. The shooters took off in several vehicles, including a red pickup truck belonging to Austin McCalla, Pressler's then-boyfriend. The teen was found driving the vehicle not long after the shooting, and the police took her into custody. McCalla and 3 others were charged with Rod's murder, but Pressler was released as prosecutors failed to convince a judge there was probable cause for her to be charged. Thanks for watching. For a month, would you rather be relentlessly stalked by your ex or go through a maze whenever you had to use the bathroom? Let us know in the comments section below.